Good morning, everyone. Keshe Kotnam Awan Dewake. So good morning, everyone. I said in my tribal language, I'm from Zuni Pueblo, one of the 23 tribal nations here in New Mexico. And yeah, we're happy to be here and talk to you some about cultural humility. And to start, I just want to read the land acknowledgement from here at the University of New Mexico, where we're located. The building on my background is our library, Zimmerman Library, one of our libraries. So founded in 1889, the University of New Mexico sits on the traditional homelands of the Pueblo of Sandia. The original peoples of New Mexico, Pueblo, Navajo, and Apache, since time immemorial, have deep connections to the land and have made significant contributions to the broader community statewide. We honor the land itself and those who remain stewards of this land throughout the generations, and we also acknowledge our committed relationship to Indigenous peoples. We gratefully recognize our history. So yeah, good morning. We're happy to be here. I'm Sarah Kostelecky. I am an associate professor at the University of New Mexico, and I'm also our director of digital initiatives and scholarly communication. And I'll let Lori and David introduce themselves.
Hi, I'm Lori Townsend, and I am the Learning Services Coordinator, which is just another word for the instruction coordinator for the library at the University of New Mexico. I am on somewhat dodgy Wi-Fi because I'm traveling, so I'm hoping it's going to hold up for the time that we're doing this. But just in case I slow down, I apologize for that.
And hi, everyone. I'm David Hurley. I am the Discovery and Web Librarian at the University of New Mexico. I'm also on dodgy Wi-Fi as it happens, so we'll see what happens here. But again, as Sarah said, thank you so much for inviting us and being willing to talk with us. So I want to just go over what we're going to do today, how we've got this arranged. So I think it's really wonderful that you all have a copy of the special report or will be getting one soon. On the off chance you haven't had a chance to read it yet, we're going to spend a little bit of time just going over the key points of cultural humility, and then also some of these ideas around humility and culture, because those are also sometimes a little bit slippery concepts. Then looking at what it actually means to put this into practice, and then we have dedicated time for the Q&A, open discussion, however we want to do that, and a few areas built in along the way for a little bit more participation, including now.
Yes. So with that in mind, we're going to start off with a little reflection. So we're going to begin by talking about curtains. So one day I was complaining to Sarah and David after visiting my in-laws about how uncomfortable their house made me feel. They live in this beautiful custom mid-century modern house with an entire, this is not their house, by the way, on the slide. The picture of the house would not look like this, but it has an entire wall of windows facing the street. And they have no curtains on those windows. And I also whined a bit to David and Sarah about how my husband doesn't feel the need to close the curtains at night. If he's home before me, I'll come home into the house lit up and all the curtains open for the entire neighborhood to see. And his attitude is that if people are looking in the house, in our house, and they see something they don't like, that's on them. This makes me uncomfortable, as I like to go around as it's getting dark and close all of the curtains. Sarah and David shared that they also live in similarly divided households where one person likes closed curtains at night and the other one really doesn't care. So with that example, we want to start with everyone taking a few minutes to think about something that someone you are close to does differently than you, or to put it another way, something they just do wrong. They do the wrong way. So this could be a close friend, a spouse, in-laws, children. And so once you've thought about this wrong way that they do things, we want you to consider the following questions. So what was your first reaction on finding out that they did it this way? And how has it impacted you? Did you have to adjust your behavior or ideas about this? And how did that adjustment go? So we'll set a little timer for a couple of minutes and you can just think about this. If you want to scratch, some notes down on a piece of paper or on your computer, that would be great. And then we'll come back and talk a little bit about it. So for our example of closing the curtains, briefly, I will share a little debrief, and then I'm going to ask if anybody's willing to share their examples. But basically, like, we've just had to adjust to this. We've had to negotiate a little bit about, we have some windows open and, some curtains open, some that are closed. And I think that this is probably seems like a silly thing, but it's illustrating in a small way that what is normal to each of us individually is not necessarily a norm for others, even people that we're very close to, right? People who are in our lives on a daily basis. And so our norms can be about some things like curtains, which is a somewhat intimate, but it's a kind of trivial thing, or about bigger, more important things that really concern our worldview and closely held values. So is anyone willing to share an example from their lives? We'd love to see it either in chat or just by unmuting
Sure.
themselves.
Well,
And
thanks for
I see
sharing.
in the chat the dishwasher, right? I think that's a classic one too, where that might also exist in my household. The completely incompatible ideas about how to load the dishwasher. And actually, a lot of them, when we were talking about these, a lot of things that we came up with were food things too, either sort of types of food or how people eat food. And there do seem to be a lot of these things. So I think we can continue on. If you have stories that you want to share, put them in the chats, because I think they're fun.
Yes.
But I wanted to start with talking a little bit about what is cultural humility. And at its most basic, it's an approach to making change, to see where change is needed, and then to actually make those changes to improve services, to improve the workplace, to improve relationships. And we recognize it's not a magic bullet. We're not going to solve diversity, equity, and inclusion this morning, nor is it the only way to make change, but we think it's a good way of interacting with the world, one that can reduce harm, one that can make things better. And we also know that there are a lot of different ways that humility can look in practice. So as we talk about what cultural humility is and how you might get started, we're going to weave in stories from others, particularly stories that are from our new book that just came out like last week, so we're pretty excited about it. They kind of illustrate what cultural humility looks like as practiced by different people in different library contexts. And the way this book came about was we knew people were doing cultural humility, and we wanted to know, like, well, what does this look like in youth services? What does this look like in all of these different areas? And so that's what that book is. So we started this with having you think about someone or some people that you care about who have a different way of doing things than you do. But it's really easy to frame those differences as being less normal. And we did that on purpose, right? Laurie said, things people do wrong, but it's actually like pretty common to hear people talk that way. Like in England, people drive on the wrong side of the road, or in South America, winter and summer are backwards. Or even, I don't have a culture, I'm just white. And this way of saying things shows that the speaker is setting up their normal as the normal, right? So that their experiences are at the center and everything else is a variation, right? We say plain vanilla, but we never say plain pistachio, even though both are added flavors. So this can be a really hard habit to break. This idea that decentering yourself, that's another key part of practicing cultural humility. And Sarah, if you can jump, I think 2 slides ahead, skip over the my norms aren't normal, which we talked about, into this one. And I just want to talk about this slide for a moment because, right, this is the famous Apollo, I'll get wrong which Apollo, but the blue marble photograph. And apparently this is actually the way it was taken with Antarctica on top, but NASA flipped it because that's the way we usually orient our globes. And even knowing that it doesn't make any more sense to say one side of a ball floating in space is the top, it's really hard to look at this and not think it's upside down, right? And even in, I think, the Wikipedia article where I found the image, right? And the article is about how this is the original orientation of the photo. and then the image file is blue marble flipped.jpg or something like that, right? So it really is hard to break out that habit. But I also want to emphasize that this idea of decentering yourself doesn't mean devaluing yourself. Just because it's totally fine that people in England drive on the left doesn't make it wrong that people in the US drive on the right. And I use the example of driving in England because it's easy to see that there's no inherently better side to drive on. And it's also really easy to see what the consequences might be if you don't know that particular different norm, if you happen to be driving in England, or even if you're just trying to cross the street and you're which way do you look before you step into the road. But that's not a great example in some ways because it's not realistic that you will know all of the different ways that all of the different people that you encounter are different, right? Your library is open, people come in, you don't know who they are. So instead, cultural humility asks you to recognize that the person in front of us is different from us in ways that maybe we can't see, maybe they can't readily be explained, and that those differences are still important. So we might think of this in terms of differences based on race or religion or national origin, but it can be just as important between people who are members of the same culture. So there's a chapter in our book by Rhiannon Sorrell, and she is a Navajo librarian working on the Navajo Nation at a college that is 97% Navajo, and even there she finds this approach useful. Okay, so why does this matter so much? One of the key ideas in cultural humility is that if you rely only on your own ideas of what's normal, and use those ideas to interpret situations or other people's actions, then you can misunderstand people's motives, the goals, and what barriers they face. And if you are planning, providing, or evaluating your services based on those assumptions, it's going to be problematic. You'll create structures that don't fit the reality that you didn't see. Right? It's not going to end well for those eggs if we close this carton. So in our book, Carrie Valdez, who is now the library director of the public library up in Moab, Utah, shares a story from earlier in her career where she was working at the circ desk when a woman came in with 3 young kids wanting to get them library cards. So long story short, the woman was their stepmom. The kids already had library accounts that were old with overdue books, hundreds of dollars in fines and fees. The biological mother who had had the books was in jail. So those books weren't coming back. The stepmom wouldn't pay hundreds of dollars for books that she had never seen. So the kids couldn't get library cards. And maybe this seems fair from the library's perspective, right? The accounts had fines on them. You can't use the library until you clear your accounts. It seems reasonable. But we all know how families work, right? We know that there are step parents and foster parents and half siblings and ex-step parents and guardians and grandparents and custody battles and all of this stuff. But this policy assumed one kind of family where there are 2 married parents who are responsible for their children. And that's an implicit assumption. It's not in the policy anywhere, but you see it for the kids whose families aren't that way, right? This was a policy that's intended to make parents responsible for their children, but it created a situation where the children were basically held responsible for their parents. And that seems pretty unfair from the kids' perspective. So the library doesn't get its books back, the fines don't get paid, and the kids don't get to use the library, despite the library existing and having the mission and the parents' desire to have the kids use the library. So it's a lose-lose situation. And this story has a postscript. Moab is a small town. Decades later, when Carrie Valdez was the director, she had to call the police, as sometimes you have to when you're working in a library. And the officer who responded told her the story of how much his mom hated the library, how they had gone as kids to get library cards, but the librarians were really mean, and they had left the library in tears. And all 3 of those kids, one of whom's now the police officer, and his 2 siblings, they all had kids of their own, and none of them had ever stepped foot in the library. So it's generations of ill will, generations of kids who aren't using the library. It's a lose, 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 lose. I don't even know how many loses kind of situation, right? So when the people who are making the policies are embedding their norms into them, in this case, unconsciously, it's creating structures that really negatively impact the groups for whom those norms don't apply. right? Um, the rest of Carrie's chapter is really outlining her process for actually revisiting all of her library's policies and services, thinking about the mission of the library and what barriers to library services they might actually be creating for the people that they serve. Okay, two more things that we can talk about from that story. Context and power. So we're going to go into these in a little bit more depth later, but for now, let's just start by recognizing that context matters. And by that, I mean that what happens in the library just isn't just about what's happening in the library, right? People have things going on in their lives. There are things going on in the world. That's true for patrons, that's true for staff, right, for everyone. Sometimes you know the context. In this case, when the police officer came back to the library on a call and told Carrie his story, he was giving her the context of his relationship to the library. And that she remembered it from her perspective meant she had a pretty full understanding of what happened and what that history was. But he probably only gave that context because he was there as a police officer in a professional capacity being called in to help, right? Carrie doesn't write about this, but I would bet that if one of his siblings had taken their kids to the library, they wouldn't have walked up to the desk and said, hey, last time I was here, I was a little kid dealing with a lot of family stuff and you made my mom cry, right? But that context has an impact. In this case, the impact is that they never actually came in. In some places in the US, you'll be dealing with people who are bringing their grandkids into libraries that they weren't allowed into themselves as kids because of their race. Or that the memories of coming to story times with their mom are among their most treasured memories, right? Or it might be a context that is totally unrelated to the library. I had a guy come in when I was working at the Albuquerque Public Library to get his son, who's like a first grader, a library card. And when I asked him for his ID to check his record, his body language changed dramatically. He went on high alert. It was dramatic enough that even I was able to put two and two together, clarify that I was looking up his library record to make sure he didn't have any overdue books. And from then on, I always use the term library account instead of record, right? That was a word that he was hearing differently than I meant. So context matters. And those are all examples where either you could see it, or you could, in the case of the guy with his son, I could figure out there was something else going on. That's not always possible. The other aspect is power. And cultural humility was first proposed in the context of healthcare, where there are very clear power differentials between doctors and patients. And doctors know that if they don't account for them, they may miss important information leading to worse health outcomes for their patients, right? That's well documented in medicine, but it's also true in libraries. It's just that power is more complicated in our settings. When Carrie Valdez is at the circulation desk, she's in a position of power, and she's wielding that institutional power of the library when she wouldn't let the kids get cards. But, and again, she didn't write about this, but she very well may have also felt powerless in that situation. Since she didn't write the policy, it's just her job to enforce it. And even as a director who does write the policy, you might feel powerless because of the way the laws are, or the city's policies, or whatever. When I was new at the University of New Mexico, our then Dean of Libraries said, deans just have no power at this institution, to a room of us junior librarians who were all like 3 or 4 or 5 layers down in the hierarchy, right? So I think it's a lot easier for all of us to see the limits of our power, or where we have less power, than where we do have power. And conversely, it's easier to see where other people do have power, especially if their power impacts us. And all this ties back to the discussion of norms and perspectives. The more the power structures favor your perspective, the more invisible they are to you, and the harder it is to see any negative impacts they might have on others. So part of the practice of cultural humility is to be actively aware that there may be important context that you don't know. So practicing cultural humility means listening. It means working to be aware of ways that context and power can impact an interaction. It means listening to people in the way they want to be heard, even if that challenges our assumptions or doesn't match our perspective. And it's not easy to think about how things you aren't aware of might be influencing interaction, right? That's kind of the definition of not being aware of them. So one way to start on that, and this is a foreshadowing that we have another activity. One way to start on that is to reflect on a time where the context mattered for you, and to think about how it impacted that situation and how the other person might have been able to pick up on it. So let's take a few minutes and reflect on an interaction. It could be a customer service type interaction, but it doesn't have to be, where there was more going on than the other person could see. And if we can put up the slide with a couple of questions to consider, right? So basically, what was the interaction? And then in what way did the context impact the interaction or the outcome? How might it have gone differently if the other person had known the context? And finally, how might they have been aware of that context? And I'll give my example as you begin to think about your own. This is years ago, before there was audible.com. My mother, who's not a library user, complained about the price of audiobooks on CD. I told her that, I bet your public library will have them, because at least in the Albuquerque Public Library, they were circulating constantly. We had a huge collection. Her response was, librarians are so difficult to deal with, which I didn't take personally at all, right? It was maybe a little bit of my rebellion that I became a librarian. My mother didn't even have a library card, but this was my chance to convert her, right? So we go into her local library, which was very nice, and we look around for a bit, and I see there's some books on tape, but I don't find the books on CD. So we walk up to the desk, and I say very politely, I see you have a collection of books on tape. Do you also have audiobooks on CD? And the person behind the desk says, yes. And we stare at each other for a few moments, and I can just feel the I told you so emanating out from my mother. So I say, well, thank you very much. And we walk out the door, right? Now, I think if they had known the context, most library people would have taken the opportunity to highlight how great the library is, right? If there's anything you want that isn't here, let us know. We can check if another library in the system has it, or we can interlibrary loan, or we can purchase it, right? That kind of thing was what I was expecting. And I felt like I was trying to communicate, we're new here and need some salesmanship, by being kind of exaggeratedly friendly and polite, rather than just, where are the audiobooks? The librarian probably thought, this very hairy individual is behaving unusually, yellow alert. Or maybe even more likely, they were trying to match my friendliness with some straight-faced humor, just answering the literal question that I asked. And that's actually something that I would totally appreciate in the usual context, just not when I'm trying to convince my mother that librarians are not difficult to deal with, right? So that's my story. Take a couple of minutes to reflect on your own. Again, if you want to put it in the chat, that's fantastic. If you want to ask a question at this point, that's a great time for it too. If you just want to think about it on your own and keep it to yourself, also fine.
Now we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about this, breaking down this term cultural humility. I'm a big fan of sort of talking about definitions and making sure we're all on the same page. So I think you might have heard the term cultural competence before, but as a phrase, cultural humility might seem a bit mysterious. So before we get into how to practice cultural humility, we're going to pause and consider these two elements. So we're going to start with the idea of culture. What is it? And when someone says the word culture, you might first think of things that represent a culture different from your own, maybe something that seems foreign. And sometimes the way culture is talked about in other approaches to diversity, equity, inclusion, like cultural competence, can reinforce this idea, because the focus is often on people who are citizens of different nations or might be members of minoritized populations in the United States. Or you might think of what we sometimes call high culture, which concerns certain parts of culture in the United States that have often been associated with a high income. However, when we talk about culture here, we mean culture is what people do. In our curtain example, the tendency to keep curtains open or closed at night would be an element of culture, perhaps not a super important one, but still a cultural trait. This perspective on culture does leave some things out, but it's helpfully inclusive, and it doesn't place a particular value on any aspect or type of culture. It's a good place to start. To expand our definition of culture a bit, culture is what people think, what people do, and what people make. And it's shared, learned, transmitted cross-generationally, symbolic, adaptive, and integrated. So this establishes culture as something of importance that we do in groups and gives a name to some of the different ways that it can manifest in our lives. So culture is important and pervasive. Our curtain example isn't meant to diminish the importance of culture in our lives, but only to emphasize its ubiquity. Culture shows up in everything we do. And culture is always changing. It is constantly contested and negotiated by insiders. This may not seem obvious to outsiders, but it's happening all the time. Of course, you can clearly see here that public forms of dress used to be much more formal in the past than in the modern era. I'm definitely poking fun here because it appears that dressing up cats is a very persistent cultural trait. Who knew? And finally, we want to highlight the idea of personal culture. Culture is not a monolith, because it is practiced by a bunch of individuals who are members of a culture. Therefore, we like this idea of personal culture, which refers to an individual's personal expression of their heritage and culture. As an outsider, we might learn about a given culture, but we won't know how a member of that culture chooses to express their culture unless we pay careful attention to them. And one thing that I will say about that curtain example is that I actually told that story to another, so my husband is half German. I told that story to another German, and they were absolutely appalled that a German would not have curtains in their house. So if I had gone into that interaction thinking that, oh, his mom is German, and expecting something from her because of that, I would have been totally wrong. Fortunately, I didn't know anything about Germans, but again, that personal expression of culture really does vary by individuals. So what cultural humility asks us to do is keep ourselves open to hearing from the individual in front of us as to their personal culture. So I'm going to talk about another chapter from the book called Getting Past Approachability, What Cultural Humility Brings to Library and Information Science Education. Liliana Montoya and Sarah Polkinghorn, who were a library school professor and student, wrote this chapter together, begin by asking how librarians learn to interact with people, which leads to this exploration of the concept of approachability, which is something that is taught to library school students and is in some of our sort of standards. So to the new librarian, approachability is framed as this sort of crucial make or break moment in the reference interaction, and advice given includes like making eye contact or a smile goes a long way. But a problem with approachability is that it's not just about what we do and how we are acting, but how we are perceived. The authors point out that most of the advice around approachability skips over the issue of, quote, what it means to be perceived as approachable by patrons. And it also ignores more objective criteria in the reference interaction, such as visibility. So they argue that incorporating cultural humility into our teaching for new librarians about reference interactions can serve as, quote, the beginning of an ongoing practice of reflecting on their own positionality and the partiality of their expertise. So this awareness of partial expertise is one of the most powerful points that Liliana and Sarah make. They point out that, quote, it is essential to engage with the user with an interpersonal stance of humility and openness rather than from a superior role as the expert. We can determine what is important to them. We can work on power imbalances and motivate them to feel they are equal participants in the interaction. So now that we've explored this concept of culture and reflected on the changing culture of librarianship, we're going to take a look at humility. So in common parlance, the word humility has some negative associations, some connotations: low status, low self-worth, low self-esteem, sort of this underestimation of your value, which goes back to that whole thing that David made the point about culture humility is not about devaluing yourself. So the field of positive psychology has a different take on humility. And so I'm going to look at humility from that perspective. So in that conception, it's a personal trait that we possess as individuals. And according to June Price Tangney, who is a scholar who I will quote quite a bit, there are several dimensions of humility, which she described as a neglected virtue. Humility means admitting we aren't perfect. This involves, quote, an ability to acknowledge one's mistakes, imperfections, gaps in knowledge, and limitations, end quote. Being aware that we can get things wrong isn't admitting we're terrible, but just that we are human. The humble are also open to new ideas and information, including irreconcilable or conflicting information. This orientation allows the humble to continue learning and building new knowledge throughout their lives. Being open to learning new stuff means we have to be open to being mistaken in our current understandings. Humility also involves a sense of perspective. Those with perspective, to quote Tangney, can keep their abilities and accomplishments or place in the world in perspective, e.g., seeing oneself as just one person in the larger scheme of things. This aspect of humility means that we acknowledge that we have both talents and faults and are but a very small creature in a very large world. Another aspect of humility is, quote, an appreciation of the value of all things, as well as the many different ways that people and things can contribute to our world, end quote. This characteristic introduces an element of joy and wonder into humility. Not only are the humble open to new information, but they also appreciate and celebrate the value of that information. Okay, so the next characteristic, we're getting into the parts of humility that feel the most transformative. And I'm pretty sure that this element was the most surprising to me at first. And in particular, the word accurate was confusing. It seemed to contradict that common understanding of humility as an underestimation of ourselves. However, it has been shown again and again that humans have a tendency to overestimate our positive qualities and abilities. We throw shade on others while ignoring our own faults. So perhaps the emphasis on accurate self-knowledge is not surprising. It is, however, daunting. It's much easier to see humility as just me having to accept I'm not worth much. And I actually prefer another perspective on this particular element of accurate assessment. It's one that authors Peterson and Seligman offer in their book, Character, Strengths, and Virtues. They refine this to our perspective on humility implies a willingness to see the self accurately rather than the absolute attainment of accuracy. Nonetheless, from our perspective, accuracy is secondary to whether a person is willing and able to weigh information in a non-defensive way. I like this because it speaks to an attitude and a habit of mind rather than a preoccupation with how I see myself. Part of the reason Peterson and Seligman can give accuracy a bit of a shrug, sure, give it a shot, it's a good thing, is that probably the most important aspect of humility is stated by Tangney thus: a relatively low self-focus, a forgetting of the self, while recognizing that one is but part of the larger universe. So yes, we can be open to being honest with ourselves about ourselves, but more importantly, we can try to just stop thinking about ourselves so much. So we want to hesitate before devoting time to worrying about how others see us, how we see ourselves, and so on. So Tangney quotes Templeton's expression of this phenomenon as becoming unselfed. And so this, again, doesn't mean that we devalue ourselves, but it means that we shift our attention to others. And to quote Tangney again, our eyes are opened to the beauty and potential in those around us. It means that we start seeing others as more valuable, and our perspective on ourselves shifts accordingly. And when we start noticing the beauty and value of others, we maybe worry less about defending our own value. True humility is more like self-forgetfulness. It leaves people free to esteem their special talents, and with the same honesty to esteem their neighbors. Both the neighbor's talents and one's own are recognized as gifts, and like one's height, are not fit subjects for either inordinate pride or self-deprecation. So the two fundamental features of humility as it relates to culture of humility can be summarized as accuracy, as opposed to modesty or devaluing, and becoming unselved in an appreciative and self-reflective way. Encouraging and developing these two habits of mind and self lead to a whole host of associated behaviors. So how does this translate into the practice of cultural humility? Sarah's going to talk about that.
The thing you came here for.
Yeah, not the cat pictures. I recognize there's a lot of cat pictures, and that may not be what you were coming here for.
Cats wearing clothes. Always fun. So yeah, now that we have some grounding, right, in cultural humility as a concept and the role of humility in culture, so how can we practically bring that into our daily lives? So next, we want to share some elements that we've identified in our recent special report, which you maybe have read, you might read at some point, that can help all of us to practice cultural humility. And sorry for my papers. We start with this because it's really hard for most, if not all of us. It's hard for me. When we're interacting with another person using a cultural humility approach, we want to be other-oriented and focused on them. So one way we can do this is by bringing in active listening skills, which encourage us to listen to the other person and leave our own emotions and reactions to the side. So this means really listening, not maybe half listening, while at the same time planning what we're going to say once the other person is done talking. So when we actively listen to someone, it reinforces another element of cultural humility, the idea that we can't know everything and we shouldn't expect to. If we make the assumption that we know what the other person needs before they even tell us, we can miss what they're actually trying to share with us. And maybe initially this seems not too difficult, right? We can listen. I think about interactions I've had with people at the reference desk where things went well. I listened and I asked questions to clarify what the patron needed, and the patron left happy. But when we think about some of those other patrons we worked with who were upset or angry and seemed to be unfairly directing those feelings at us, like, hey, I didn't make this policy, that's when we want to develop our skills to minimize our defensiveness. And if the situation is getting tense, taking a deep breath can be a useful pause to take a moment before reacting, possibly in a way that could increase the tension. Lori, I had you as the next slide, but do you want me to read it?
Yeah, no, go ahead. I'm good.
Okay.
I'm there.
Sorry.
I'm just waiting for the slide to turn.
Okay, sorry.
No, it's all good. So you've probably heard the saying, the best defense is a strong offense. I think that reveals something about the nature of defensiveness. When we feel vulnerable, we sometimes take what the other person is saying as some kind of attack, and then we respond likewise. When we think of the word defense, I think we might tend to think of something passive or protective, like a wall or armor, which it can be. We might feel that we are simply protecting ourselves, but it's often experienced by others as an active attack. So really, defensiveness is a kind of offense, and we don't want to be starting fights with others. So what can we do instead?
Yeah, so what can we do? Well, so another technique we can try is to bring curiosity to the interaction, right? Thinking about why we might be feeling that way we are in the moment. For me, this skill reminds me of a part of mindfulness practice. Some of you may be aware of that or practicing it already, but working on mindfulness involves noticing things like, your body, your thoughts, your surroundings, but without judgment or reaction. So utilizing these skills can help us to truly listen to other people who we're interacting with, and it can help us minimize our defensiveness. But also to clarify, we aren't suggesting that you can't defend yourself in an interaction or that you have to agree with everything another person is saying to you. That's not what it is. Cultural humility is really about doing our best to focus on the other person while minimizing the focus on ourselves. And another element of cultural humility practice is working to recognize other perspectives. So this can help remind us that our norms, again, aren't necessarily normal for everyone else. And we can work to listen to the other person to understand what they're trying to communicate to us. So for this element, I think about my sister and how our communication has changed over the years. So she used to tell me about, something difficult happening in her life. And my thought was to share solutions to fix these problems, which was my assumption about what she wanted from me. Finally, she told me that sometimes she just wanted me to listen to her. She wanted support and she wanted me to empathize and not, tell her what to do to fix things. So that really helped me understand that I was using my own filter to hear what she was saying, rather than, again, focusing on what she wanted from me in that particular moment. And I try to remember this when I'm talking with patrons, with colleagues, and of course, my family too, that they each have a specific need for our interaction, and I shouldn't assume that I know what that is. But that's hard. And this aspect of practice includes recognizing the context where the interaction is occurring and how these elements may affect everyone involved and can affect everyone involved in different ways. So David was talking about context and we did that activity. Again, we each individually bring our own personal culture, identities, and experiences to an interaction. And we should give space for the other person to share which of these is relevant to our mutual interaction. Also, the structures, policies, and history of an organization, like a library, should also be considered as part of the context of an interaction. So cultural humility asks us to consider the context because it can affect the power dynamics in a situation, and ignoring the context can possibly lead to misunderstanding or harm. So for example, if a student comes up to me at the reference desk and asks for the section with books on health communication and they're in a hurry, honestly, my initial reaction might be annoyance because their topic is too broad. And there's, of course, not one maybe section they could even browse. I would probably suggest that we work on refining their question, and that would take some time. The student might hear that and get frustrated and leave, with me assuming maybe, they don't want to take the time to do their research. But my actions might be different if I learn the student is also a parent who's going to be late picking up their child from daycare and is going to have to work on this assignment this evening to try to finish it because it's due tomorrow. Though I won't know the backstory of the student unless they share that with me, I could instead try to bring curiosity to the situation, interaction, and remember there are many reasons why people might be pressed for time. I could ask how much time the student has to work on this assignment now, possibly offering to work with them via email to narrow their topic and suggesting possible resources. And because we are library workers, we work in libraries, we're well situated to learn about other perspectives because we have easy access to and are surrounded by all kinds of materials that share stories and experiences by others that are different from our own. And we also know how to find accurate information. So this is another chance for us to stay curious, to get out of our self-focus and pay attention to those unlike ourselves, to learn about different norms. Recognizing other perspectives also means we are also willing to accept when our current understandings are wrong and learn new ones. It's particularly important that we strive for accuracy in line with Lori's earlier discussion about key aspects of humility. But one caveat to this part of cultural humility practice, we can never really understand what it's like to be in another person's shoes, even someone from a culture that we also might identify with. So it's really better to focus on listening to them and working to understand what they're sharing with us. Again, this may seem hard. It's hard. It's hard to do. But another aspect of recognizing other perspectives can be finding joy in the process of learning about the history and culture of others, celebrating the many ways people experience the world and share it with us. I like Lori's description of this as finding and listening to the stories all around us, whether that's with people in person or through art or through the written or spoken word. So finding the joy in these stories. So now, even though the practice of cultural humility is about decentering ourselves and our perspective, it's important still to take time to reflect on our reactions, our words, our thoughts, and our feelings. When we take a look at ourselves, when we take a look at ourselves, we think about how we can listen better and appreciate others more fully. We can reflect on the ways we can improve our practice and be more deliberate with our words and our actions. Critical self-reflection means an active pause to reconsider and a willingness to be honest with ourselves about ourselves. So this could involve reflecting on any assumptions we may have thought during the interaction and how that might have played a role in how things went. It could also be considering any power imbalances that were present during the interaction and what power you might have had in that particular moment. And while cultural humility asks us to critically self-reflect, we also should remember to have compassion for ourselves throughout this process. So another example from our edited book is an example of cultural humility in practice, and that's by Sylvia Lynn Hannock and Kelsey Keys in their chapter about evaluating children's literature using cultural humility. So both of them were co-chairs of the ALA committee RISE, a feminist book project for ages 0 to 18. And then their chapter, they lay out 3 principles: seeking accuracy and completeness, decentering ourselves as readers, and recognizing and mitigating power imbalances. They also tell moving stories about selecting books as both librarians and as mothers. And they talk about how they work to overcome nostalgia and tradition and look past their own preferences when considering children's literature. So they say in the chapter, as librarians selecting books for young readers, we read not only for ourselves, but also for our communities in all their visible and invisible diversities. To meet our community's needs, we must decenter our own reaction to a book to consider how someone unlike us might receive it. And this is just a really great chapter.
It is, it's a great chapter. So I imagine at least some of us are Terry Pratchett fans. And this is a quote from a Terry Pratchett book. First thoughts are the everyday thoughts. Everyone has those. Second thoughts are the thoughts you think about the way you think. People who enjoy thinking have those. Third thoughts are thoughts that watch the world and think all by themselves. They're rare and often troublesome. Listening to them is part of witchcraft. I like to think of critical self-reflection as having those second thoughts. That being said, I think we can be mindful about our own personal tendencies with this tip. If we tend to be a bit anxious, this can lead to a lot of second, third, and fourth guessing of ourselves into a little downward spiral. If that's you, that's me. It's great to remember that we don't need to think too much about ourselves and that cultural humility is a practice. It's actions, not just concepts or thoughts. And that practice allows us to make mistakes, correct those mistakes, make amends, and move on. Though I will say that if you can get those third thoughts up and running, you might become some sort of powerful cultural humility wizard. I personally haven't leveled up to third thoughts quite yet. So in the end, we see cultural humility as an approach to making change while reducing harm, which is what David started with. It gives us some practical techniques for working with each other with all our glorious, infuriating, confusing, and wonderful differences. It is relatively simple, but simple is not easy. Cultural humility is work, but we are at work and we believe in what we do. It has meaning and value. And we all want to make our libraries welcoming spaces full of energy and learning and joy for everyone. So the road ahead is long and full of challenges, and we might as well stay friends along the way. We think cultural humility can help us do that. So to wrap up, we're going to do a little reflection activity, one more reflection activity. So we were hoping that you might think about and identify one aspect of your working life where you can incorporate something of cultural humility practice. And we assume actually that most of you are already doing this to at least some extent. I think librarians as professionals, that is to me part of how we orient ourselves, is in a culturally humble way. But we can always improve. And so we're asking for an element that you might think about, that you can add some cultural humility, something that challenges you, maybe, and think about anything from the presentation or ideas about cultural humility that resonated. So if there's something that, I don't know if we want to give a minute or two for folks to think about that, and then we might share out. Okay, I'll share my own thing that I try to work on. And I also think that we can take examples from our own environment. So I tend to be defensive. It's not a thing I like about myself. It is something that I tend to react to things defensively. And there's all kinds of reasons for that. Who knows why? But one of the things that I actually do is I observe the people in my work environment whose reactions I admire. Sarah is one of those people, and there's a couple of other ones. She, despite the fact that she may have said she gets defensive, she rarely gets defensive. Sarah is very kind, and so she's a really wonderful example of cultural humility, and I'm making her embarrassed. But it helps me to think about how these other folks who I admire, their reactions to situations, how they might react in that situation, to think about how I can be less defensive and how I can focus on others and how I can always try to be kind to others. So that's something that I work on, and I use the examples of people in my workplace to help me, people who I think embody some aspect of cultural humility or that practice. And does anybody else want to share? And I do see we have questions in the Q&A. Yeah, that's a.
And I'll start on that question, and then, but if other people want to share too. So the question is about this idea that decentering is not devaluing, and the fact that people really do see it that way, and how can you reinforce that it's not devaluing, right? And I think that is something, and it's an interesting one, right? When we talk about like your norms aren't inherently normal, to me that feels like there are people for whom that statement is obvious, and there are people for whom that statement is obviously wrong. Like what is normal is normal, and that it's a really hard, you know, that maybe it's a threshold concept. Like once you cross that barrier, then it becomes easy to see like right, left side, right side. It's just the way people do things, or it's just the way, you know, so working on it for yourself, it's that seeing other perspectives. And some of the things in the chat, like suddenly taking a class as an adult, you know, or talking to somebody else who's an adult who's taking a class and getting that different perspective, or thinking about your response in a medical situation, and comparing that to how people might interact with the libraries. How you encourage it in others is really tricky. And there's also a challenge, right? You know, we are wanting to be very careful not to weaponize cultural humility. You know, maybe you just need to be a little bit more culturally humble, right? Like talk about things that are going to make people defensive. That's going to make people defensive. So it's a really good question of how do we help other people see that decentering isn't devaluing. And I'd be interested to hear what others think. I mean, in some ways, I feel like library work is really tied to this, right? Because we are collecting these stories and providing things in there, but we also know that people get um, sometimes unhappy when the library's collections include stories that don't match what they consider normal. So yeah, maybe it is just modeling.
I would also say that we can ask people to do things. Like one of the things that I think folks maybe miss out on sometimes is how much fun it is to actually notice the wonderful things that other people bring to a situation and how much joy you get from that. It becomes its own self-reinforcing concept. And I know there are sort of, I don't know, that they feel a little terrible, but there are like activities where people say, say something that you value about this person, and you go around the room and, you do that kind of stuff. But I actually think those kinds of things, they're corny, but they can be good. Like say something that you value about the person next to you. So that kind of modeling where you just get in the habit of just seeing the things that, people bring into a situation and noticing the good things. And so much of this to me is about that action. It's like taking the action, like getting out of our heads and just saying the thing, giving the compliment, talking to someone, and listening to them and really hearing them, being active. So much of this to me is about that action. So I think that if you model it and maybe you have some little things that you have people try out, they will recognize how good it actually feels, like how it can be challenging, but how it's actually just rewarding just in and of itself to decenter yourself. And I speak as someone who is an introvert and who feels very awkward to have attention on me, right? And so I do think that it's wonderful to be able to put attention on somebody else in a positive way, so that they feel like, so that hopefully they're feeling good about themselves, and I'm just being honest. So that would be what I would say about that, although that's not a perfect answer. So
Well, I think the curiosity and the joy part, right? This was something I came across in a different context, was talking about, it's actually related to teaching students to think critically about Google results or something like that. And I was talking about, sharing with them the unbridled joy of critical thinking. But it's an interesting thing, right? Because this curiosity, I have a relative who, talking about people that you look up to, who is really good. Like the happiest he ever is if you show him he's wrong. Like he just thinks that is interesting and kind of hilarious, right? And like it's that kind of joy in the world where when he realizes that one of his assumptions wasn't right, that things aren't the way he was thinking, he loves that. And I think that cultivating that kind of attitude, and maybe it is a modeling it, like, and if you are trying to work with somebody else who is getting very defensive, feeling like their norms are being devalued, maybe if you can kind of create an infectious joy around, no, the world is bigger than we think, maybe that's the best way to model it too.
But we are speaking about preparation too, right? We are saying that you want to put in thought and work. If you're thinking about, maybe, interacting with some folks, and maybe people you work with, and maybe you're like, oh, I'd love to open minds and I'd love to, encourage this kind of thing. It is taking work on your part, right? An investment of time, an investment of preparation, investment of things that you can think of examples. So this is part of that work, right? That's part of the work that we do when we're trying to be aware and trying to make change, is to do that preparing, like we do for teaching. I mean, we're all teachers, so we've all done teaching in libraries. And so you have to have a lesson plan, and you have to do that prep. And that's really where the teaching is in the preparation you do before you go in. So that we didn't talk about. I realized we left out culture, humility, and leadership. We did not talk that much about it. That's something we have talked about in the past, because we talked a lot about power. and power differentials and sort of recognize your own power. But really leaders, if you're in any kind of position of power, you really, any kind of, just a sort of positional power, you're a manager or you're running something, even if it's like a small bit, you may not feel powerful, but you're a manager. It really does make a difference when you're willing to act with cultural humility, because it's you have more, when you have more power, the cultural humility just spreads wider. And so we really feel like this is something that leaders can take advantage of, but it does take courage. And it is hard as a leader to behave in this way. I think we just gave kind of example of bad leadership, David, with our old dean.
Not our current dean.
Not our current dean. We're not insulting our current dean. With our old dean and the comments he made. And that just shows you that David remembers that from that long ago, how impactful that was for him to say that.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Well, right. And I think, I have been a library director myself, and I feel like at a much smaller library than the University of New Mexico. But I think when you're the library director, maybe when you're the dean, you don't feel like you're that far removed from the other people you're working with, right? And so, you might say, well, everybody feels comfortable coming to talk to me. I certainly hear plenty of complaints, because you don't see when people don't come talk to you, or you don't see when they're sitting there thinking this person is floor level, this is my boss's boss's boss, and actually will make the decision in 6 years when my probation period is over, whether or not I am looking for a new job. And so, the thing about the librarian with the challenge, there's the building the relationships and being aware of his power in the library and in the community, but not just at the moment of the challenge, right? That's the time and attention of building these relationships that comes, that means that there is a relationship there when you need it, right? And I think too often we think, oh, okay, we've got an issue going on with this part of the community, they aren't using the library, or something's going on, let's invite them in and have a focus group where we have very difficult conversations with strangers for 40 minutes. And that doesn't work well if you don't already have some basis for a relationship in there where you can talk and understand, well, what are the barriers? What are the motivations? What are we trying to do here?
This has been so lovely. I want to thank everyone who attended, and I really want to thank David and Sarah and Lori for sharing all of their work